Here we are today with Reverend Dr. Carter Hayward on October 21, 2020, just 2 weeks shy of the historic 2020 election, in the midst of a global pandemic, the world being on fire, and just ready to receive a word of hope and new imagination that Carter has to offer us today.
Thank you very much, Peace. And I think I'm going to remove my mask so that you can hear what I say.
And what was your life growing up in North Carolina?
We were just right down the street from where I grew up. We're sitting in Brevard, North Carolina right now. And I grew up in Hendersonville, right down the road. I was the first of 3 children, but I was the first by 6 years. So it was my mom and dad and me and our animals. We always had at least one dog. And we lived in a little house out, I think it's close to town now, but at the time it was out in the woods. And so there was a creek behind the house and an apple orchard in the side yard and a big wildflower field across the path. And I just loved being in the out of doors with the animals. And what was actually happening in the South at that time, really everywhere, but specifically in the South where I was, between white people and colored people. And it was very clear to me that there was something the matter with this and that this was not what God wanted. And my parents affirmed with me this was not what God wanted, but there we were in the midst of it. But I knew that this God, or I certainly did think of God as a him at that time, but this God was present in nature, and I'm not sure I ever would have used the term justice any more than I would have used the term racism, but that God wanted us to do something about this business, about white people and colored people. And just like God loved us and came to us through trees and the black snakes and the apples and each other. And so God had something to do with nature and something to do with justice.
Well, since you paved the way for women and queer people to be ordained in the Episcopal Church, I'm assuming you didn't see women preach growing up?
No, I don't know that I ever saw women preachers at all. Never even thought about women preachers, including myself. I didn't realize that girls and women could do that. Of course, at Union Seminary, which is non-denominational, I was there amid many women of my own generation who were going to be ordained, Presbyterians and Methodists and Lutheran and American Baptists, and certainly United Church of Christ and Unitarian Universalist ministers. So I was hearing women preaching in the chapel at Union, and I was very aware that Episcopalians could do this too if we could figure out how to get ourselves ordained. And so that's when the movement for the ordination of women began at that same time in the late 60s, early 1970s. And it began in no small part because so many people like me, so many women, young women at that time, were going off to seminary.
What were some of the risks or losses involved? I mean, it was also hugely controversial.
It was controversial. The losses for the first women priests, that would be the Philadelphia ordination, the first women in this country, were ordained in July of 1974. And as the first women, the risks that were taken there was that we all assumed that none of us would ever be accepted as priests in the Episcopal Church, that our ordination would mean that somehow we ourselves would be defrocked, that we would be sent away, but we hoped that what it would do would be to crack open the world of the Episcopal Church for other women coming along behind us and help the church realize that it had to open its ordination ranks to women.
What did you learn from this collective process?
We learned that the collectivity of it saved it, that if it had been any one of us, we could have easily been picked off immediately and just swept under the carpet. But with 11 of us, they couldn't do that. And the 11 of us to this very day, there are 7 of us who are still here on planet Earth alive, and the others are here in spirit. But from the very beginning, they being the powers that be who did not like that we had done this, could not play us off against each other. And we realized right from the beginning we would have nothing to do with that kind of betrayal of our sisters.
So on the 1977 sermon that we're going to be discussing, you were invited to speak at Duke Chapel just 3 years And also during a time of heightened LGBTQ and racial justice activism. What was preaching in a space like Duke Chapel like for you, with its complicated history of segregation and absence of women preachers?
Well, I read that question that you sent me with great interest because to show you how unaware I was not, I mean, I had grown up in North Carolina and I knew of Duke Chapel as this magnificent Gothic structure. I didn't know anything about its history. It had such a centerpiece in our kind of ecclesiastical imagination of what a church ought to look like. And so now a lot of that had grown beyond that. And so I knew that Duke University Chapel was not this huge big deal that I'd grown up as a child thinking it was. But I was very, very unaware of both its sexist and racist history in terms of who had not been allowed in there.
Well, and you did like an amazing job. I mean, I cannot help but share that when I first listened to your sermon, I mean, 40 plus years after, I was supposed to be transcribing, and I just couldn't, and just melted. And I think it was your courage and conviction to speak so passionately and convincingly about who God is. And
I would say that this is a very foundational sermon, and in terms of anything else I've ever preached. I probably did preach everything I've ever preached is in that one sermon, because I really do believe that the enigmatic God is a source of universal spiritual power, and totally transcends religions and us as creatures and as species. And certainly if I were to edit it at all and preach it again, I would say more in it than I do about nature and about God not only being a human spirit connecting with humans of all kinds in our woes and in our trials and tribulations and our joys and our celebrations, but also with the rest of creation, which I have always believed and experienced, but have become much more aware of as a theologian in the last 10 or 20 years.
There are several powerful images of God that you paint in this sermon, and what experiences or scripture brought them for you?
Experiences, of course, were through the women's movement and through our talking as women to each other about God as our mother and God, the femaleness of God, that God is, if God is our father at all, if that image is helpful at all, then certainly God as our mother is right there too and has to be held up there.
One of the most powerful things in that sermon too is that you flip our expectations of who God is and identify God with those who are most despised and vilified and hated in our world. And how, I imagine it must have been, you must have really, I mean, it's clear in the sermon the very careful way you craft the language and the movement. I wanted to ask about the decision to use the N-word. And
the N-word, yes.
Queer person.
Well, yes, and this is not a word I would use today in public, because, or in what I'm saying to you right now, because I'm trying so hard to listen very carefully to Black women and brown women and other women of color about my white privilege and about who we are with one another and to one another in the world. And I want to respect that in every possible way, and language is certainly one way. And when I hear very clearly that this is a word that, if it's used at all, let Black people use it about Black people. And even there it's controversial, as I'm sure you know, with some people thinking this is not even there appropriate, but certainly not for me as a white woman. So, but at the time, I wanted to make clear that racism was so evil, and that word is like an icon of evil. It's like, you know, what do you do if you really want to put somebody down and smash them into the ground? If you're a white person, you use that N-word as a way of just dismissing a Black person's humanity. And I wanted it clear that that is what happens to God, so that when we talk about who God is or where God is right there in that N being smashed to the ground or being lynched or being sent away one more time because he or she is black. And I wanted, and that word is, as I said, it's an icon of evil. And that's how I was using it, obviously to make it evil and not to in any way whiten it. And then I also used the word faggot, which has less freighted history, even though it certainly has a violent history, very violent history of being burned and horrific stuff. But I was saying to you earlier, I think if in a similar sermon today, I'd probably use the term queer, but not only because I am queer, but because we who have taken the word and have done all kinds of wonderful imaginative things with it. And we can use it for good and for evil.
So the sermon that you preached more than 40 years ago, going back to what you said about how it would be interesting to preach it now, I mean, I think for me, it was just the sheer courage that you share those things now, which I know so many Christians would just not be bold enough to say such things.
Mm-hmm. Well, I can tell you that in the context of my life in 1977, that was after the Philadelphia ordination. It was before I came out as a lesbian 2 years later. By then, I did have a good job as an assistant professor at Episcopal Divinity School in Cambridge. And my theology had always been sort of on the edge of heterodoxy and orthodoxy, always. And it was going to always be there. You know, it was going to be more heterodox than orthodox. And so I didn't mind what anybody might say about whether or not I was being a good Christian in preaching such a sermon as this. I truly believed that I was being faithful to God. And I knew that I would not be punished for that. And that leads me into this whole question about my women of color colleagues, because I am sure it must have been through the American Academy of Religion and through other groups of, collective groups of theologians and ethicists and preachers and teachers where I began to really come in contact with more women of color who were out there. And I knew that EDS needed to have input from these women of color, and not just people who were going to be on the run like me preaching, not just to come and preach and leave, but somehow to come and join the faculty. So by the early 90s, we had maybe 8 or 10 women on the faculty, and at least half, if not more, were women of color. And it's kind of these things like be careful what you pray for, because I had prayed so hard to get these women onto the faculty, and it worked. And of course, once they got there, they began challenging me because of my racism and white privilege. But you know, because the Philadelphia ordination had helped me realize that our power is in our collectivity and not as individuals, I didn't need to worry about my particular either hurt feelings or what I didn't know or how stupid I must have been to make such a statement. My concern was, okay, how can we move with this and grow with this as a collective? You know, if I'm being racist, please do tell me, and I'll do my best to correct this if I possibly can. If I have white privilege, which I'll always have as long as there's life in my body, help me understand how I can best use it to fight against racism or to become an racist, if that's what I'm always going to be.
Any last word in terms of encouraging
younger people?
Well, I think someone who has been part of many, many movements and many collectives, what advice and wisdom do you have to offer us?
Well, I think the more imaginative, the more involved with justice struggles for one and all, but perhaps choosing one that really generates your passion and going with it, but understanding that it is connected with everything else, and so other people should never be excluded. How do we always leave an opening for people that we ourselves may be damaging by what we either do or fail to do, see or fail to see? I would definitely encourage younger people not to get too boxed into organized religion, to lose your edge, your cutting edge for justice, for speaking truth.